Has she done the government a lot of damage, do you think?
Well, I think on balance Edwina Currie is a plus. She's a very forceful, colourful politician. She speaks her mind. A lot of people agree with what she says, some people don't.
To Mrs Thatcher's horror, John Major insisted on Britain joining Europe's exchange rate mechanism, the ERM, in order to fight inflation.
John Major did show a certain amount of steel because she couldn't lose two chancellors. And if the new chancellor came along and argued that we should be joining the ERM, Margaret didn't really have an alternative. Even Margaret Thatcher at that stage could not simply slung out another Chancellor of the Exchequer and try to find one that agreed with her. And into the ERM we went.
It seemed to me that Margaret was no longer examining the facts before reaching the decision. She was operating on gut instinct. And from time to time, one saw ideas put forward, perhaps sometimes tossed forward quite loosely, that just ran into the slammed door of a closed mind. In a rather breathy way, straight away, was, "I want you to second my nomination." And she wrote later that there was a palpable pause. And there was a palpable pause. I did pause. And it wasn't because I was disinclined to support her. I was always prepared to support her and second her nomination. It was because that approach, after a bad first-round ballot defeat, was exactly what had caused her so much difficulty in the party. This peremptory assumption. It was just, "I would like you to second my nomination." And it seemed to me that that was exactly the mistake of man management, and that was the reason for the pause.
John Major, closeted at home in Huntingdon, was recovering from his wisdom tooth operation. His lack of enthusiasm might have had another motive. Away from the fevered atmosphere of Westminster, he was aware that the crown was about to pass from Mrs Thatcher. It could well pass to him. By keeping his head down at home, he did very little to help the beleaguered Prime Minister, but escaped charges of disloyalty. He sent out a handwritten note to reporters, saying only that he anticipated seconding her in the next ballot.
It was poor repayment for what she had done for him. John Major certainly owed everything to Margaret Thatcher, but of course gratitude is a rare commodity in politics, and it shouldn't be expected too much.
The results of the secret ballot of Conservative MPs to elect the leader were announced in the evening on Tuesday the 27th of November 1990.
Michael Heseltine, 131. Douglas Hurd, 56. John Major, 185.
The election could have gone to another round, but Douglas Hurd and Michael Heseltine both conceded defeat immediately.
I congratulate John Major. I thank him and Douglas Hurd for an absolute...
John Major is the right leader for this task.
But he's a jolly good fellow.
After only 11 years in the House of Commons and just 3.5 years in Cabinet, John Major became leader of the Conservative Party.
I'm very pleased with the result. It was within 4 votes of our estimate. We're very pleased.
With the help of the pro-European Chris Patten, John Major wrote a speech that seemed calculated to offend Mrs Thatcher and please the Europeans.
My aims for Britain in the community can be simply stated. I want us to be where we belong, at the very heart of Europe.
John Major and Norman Lamont did not see eye to eye on the economy. The Prime Minister placed pegging the pound to the Deutschmark within the European exchange rate mechanism at the heart of the government's policy. 2 years before, he had triumphed over Margaret Thatcher and insisted that Britain join the ERM. It was his policy, and he championed it as the crucial weapon in the fight against inflation. At a time of recession, this caused much pain. In order to keep the pound at its agreed value, interest rates had to be kept high. Unemployment rose, businesses went bust, and many homeowners were trapped with mortgages they could not pay. On the 29th of July, the Prime Minister hurried to dinner with journalists from the Sunday Times. His purpose was to brief them that there could be no change in policy, but he went much further.
we argued strongly that he had to devalue. He had to get the pound down to a more competitive level, which would help our exporters, and allow him to cut interest rates at the same time. And he just wouldn't do it. He was as stubborn as he could be. He thumped the table at one stage and said, Andrew, there is no alternative.
I talked about my long-term objectives for sterling. I talked about my loathing of inflation. And I made the point that providing we could rip inflation out of the system, there was no reason, if we followed the right policies, there was no intrinsic reason why sterling shouldn't become stronger than the Deutschmark.
The conversation had been quite acrimonious, but he left in good terms. I shook hands with him and saw him out. And then I bounded back upstairs again and got into I said, did he say what I think he said? And they said, yep, he said that he wants sterling to take over as the benchmark currency of Europe. So I said, well, I think he's nuts, but it gives us a story for Sunday.
John Major's Chancellor, Norman Lamont, was horrified when he saw the newspaper report.
Frankly, I thought it was an absurd thing to say when the Deutschmark was all the time pushing up, the pound was pushing down. I thought he was living in cloud cuckoo land, and I was most upset that he had said this, because it certainly didn't correspond to what I believed was realistic, and I thought it damaged the government's credibility, because it was such a stupid thing to say.
As dawn broke that Wednesday, Black Wednesday forever after, John Major was told the head of the German central bank had made remarks which everybody took as a call for sterling to be devalued. His comments triggered mass selling of the pound.
Watch out, excuse me.
Mark, 9p20, selling 5 marks. Anyone showing just 5?
Sure enough, financial institutions, banks and speculators piled into the city foreign exchange markets that morning, selling the pound. At 8:30, the Chancellor rang the Prime Minister and asked permission to raise interest rates immediately to keep up the pound's value.
The Prime Minister at that point said that he didn't want to put up rates. He made a rather extraordinary remark. He said there were some good economic indicators appearing later in the day, which I thought was rather bizarre. But I accepted that we would intervene first.
Intervention meant spending billions buying pounds in an effort to support sterling, but it had no effect. The Prime Minister had moved his office to Admiralty House while number 10 was being refurbished. He was holding a meeting there with senior colleagues when the crisis began. The Prime Minister now doubled the stakes and made a final desperate throw. Directly against the view of the Chancellor, he ordered a 3-point rise in interest rates to 15%. Norman Lamont left the meeting at 2 o'clock and returned to the Treasury. The announcement of the 3-point rise in interest rates was made at 2:15 in the afternoon.
Anyone want to buy a house?
As the Chancellor predicted, the rate rise had no effect. Selling of the pound continued.
We were just paying holders of sterling large checks while they turned up at the Bank of England. We were hemorrhaging, we were losing reserves rapidly. We needed a decision, and he was able to concentrate on the detail, but he didn't seem able to concentrate on the big decision that had to be made.
But the decision could be put off no longer. The Chancellor and Governor of the Bank of England now returned to Admiralty House to tell the Prime Minister it was all over.
When we saw that our reserves were pretty well all gone before the end of the day, and it had not saved the situation, we realized, I can't remember what time it was, 4 or 5 in the afternoon, that there was really no alternative but to come out.
At 7:30 that evening, Norman Lamont announced the pound's suspension from the exchange rate mechanism.
Today has been an extremely difficult and turbulent day. Massive speculative flows have continued to disrupt the functioning of the exchange rate mechanism.
At the time, I was very dissatisfied with how it was handled, but there it is. I had to get on with it. I had to cope with the political storm the next day, but I didn't feel any emotion at all as I said it.
The government has concluded that Britain's best interests are served by suspending our membership of the exchange rate mechanism.
I was detached from everything other than how we dealt with the problem immediately in front of us. But the price to be paid for that was that once the crisis was over, I often became very depressed looking back at what had happened and wondering whether we might have dealt with it differently or how did it come about. And I think those depressions were a serious problem.
The forced exit from the exchange rate mechanism was a public humiliation for the government. In the immediate aftermath, currency speculators in the city celebrated a killing. They had made over £10 billion profit, betting on the fall of the pound. The Bank of England is expected to have lost £4 billion, the equivalent of £70 for every man, woman and child in Britain. But above all, it was a political calamity. At a time of deep recession, millions had watched in horror as the government raised interest rates to levels which would have done untold harm to businesses, homeowners, and the economy at large. For John Major, it was a turning point.
That evening, late at night, when I went back to my flat in Admiralty House to think about the events of the day, I sat there for some time considering what the future may be, and I wasn't at all certain either that I could or even that I should remain as Prime Minister. The case for me to resign, I thought, was fairly straightforward. I had been Chancellor when we had entered the exchange rate mechanism. I was Prime Minister when we were ejected from the exchange rate mechanism, and it was a political disaster. Was I, therefore, in a position to resurrect economic and European policy, or could it better be done by someone else?
In the course of a few weeks, the one policy...
To the opposition leader, John Smith, the disaster of Wednesday was an open goal.
He is the devalued Prime Minister of a devalued government.
1992 party conference was unlike any party conference I'd been to before or since. It was, firstly, within just a few months of winning a general election. Yet from the attitude, we might never have won it. We might even have lost it. There was no post-election feeling of euphoria, though everyone had thought we would lose. The issue was Europe, 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 Europe.
2 days into the conference, Norman Tebbit, the Thatcher loyalist and former party chairman, made a speech from the floor in which he lambasted John Major's European policy. Devastating attack.
And I hope, Prime Minister, that you will stand by your Chancellor. After all, it wasn't Norman Lamont's decision to enter the ERM.
I was astonished at Norman's speech. He, of all people, as a former party chairman, knew exactly what he was doing by making that speech in that manner at that time. It was immensely damaging. And he spoke in absolutely demonic mode. And it was a total parody of the policy that he knew we had.
Do you want to be citizens of a European Union?
I sat there and I thought to myself, you were party chairman. How would you have reacted if one of your predecessors as party chairman had come to the party conference and attacked your policy in this way, in this fashion, knowing as you do that you were misrepresenting it in the way that you were?
Well, I can't say whether anyone else would have my speech was demonic. Those who were there at the party conference, the party faithful, clearly felt that it was a speech which was pitched at just the right level. I'm sorry I had to do it in the way that I did, but he didn't take any notice of me when I did it in private.
Lady Thatcher, newly ennobled, also used the opportunity to unleash a broadside against John Major's European policy. In an article in the European newspaper, written to coincide with her own triumphal entry to the conference, she accused John Major of damaging Britain's constitutional freedom by signing up to the Maastricht Treaty. It was, in the view of one commentator, a double-barreled gun shot blast at an already open wound.
This combination of an ex-Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, and a former party chairman, Norman Tebbit, was of course lethal.
On the 4th of November 1992, the first crucial vote on the Maastricht Bill finally took place, the so-called paving motion. With so small a government majority, the future of the bill and the Prime Minister was in doubt. If the motion was rejected, the Prime Minister had warned that he would call a general election.
The ayes to the right, 319. The noes to the left, 316.
In the event, John Major won the paving motion by just 3 votes.
The House of Commons was in uproar. Round to my own backbenches, and 80% of them were waving order papers and cheering. But the other 20% weren't. They were sitting there in a great phalanx, many of them with their arms crossed, looking very grim-faced indeed, grim-faced and angry. And I knew then that there was going to be much more trouble than we had imagined in the past in getting this bill through the House of Commons.
Since Black Wednesday, John Major had lost the support of the press. Traditionally, Tory newspapers turned against the Prime Minister and savaged him at every turn. The Daily Telegraph, a bastion of Middle England and upholder of conservative values, once an ally, became a sworn enemy.
Many of us, in whom I think I'd include myself, didn't look down on him because he came from Brixton or because he hadn't an education. We came to look down on him because one found it deeply depressing to see a man who'd fought all his way through political life and had aspired to the highest office in the land, and then spent all his time when he got there complaining about how bloody difficult it was. And I think that is a pathetic position for a leading politician to find himself in.
The press criticism from all points on the political spectrum would have hurt anybody, but the Prime Minister was particularly sensitive.
He grew almost obsessively anxious about it, almost traumatized by it.
The government was still in an economic mess. The 92 election had been won on a policy of tax cutting, but public spending was running out of control. The Chancellor had no choice but to raise taxes. In the budget on the 16th of March 1993, Norman Lamont announced that he was putting VAT on fuel to raise an extra £7 billion. Although economically effective, the tax increase was another political disaster for John Major's government.
I think people did feel betrayed. I think Conservatives felt let down. When people first thought of Labour and Conservative, they thought Labour put taxes up, Conservatives do not, or Conservatives bring taxes down. So we were damaging not only what we'd said in the 1992 election, we were sort of damaging the long-term reputation of the Conservative Party. It was a serious matter.
We had to raise revenue in order to protect services. Raising revenue means raising taxes. If it wasn't value-added tax, where would it be? Income tax, some other undesirable area. There was no easy option. Sometimes in politics, you're caught between the bad and the awful.
The truth was that since Black Wednesday and the rumours about John Major's mental condition that grim day, relations between two of the most powerful men in the land had broken down. They spoke rarely, and then only on official matters. In public, the Prime Minister praised his Chancellor, but behind the scenes he agonised over his future. Norman Lamont himself refused to believe the speculation amongst colleagues and in the media that he was about to go, so soon after the Prime Minister had praised him openly and backed his budget.
We had the greatest difficulty in framing the 1993 budget. We knew it would be unpopular. I told the Prime Minister it would be unpopular. I couldn't believe that he would do that and then just a few weeks later do something that implied it had all been a tremendous error. That was what seemed to me rather difficult to believe.
Early in the morning on the 27th of May 1993, the Prime Minister summoned Norman Lamont to number 10. He told him that he wanted him to leave the Treasury and offered him the job of Environment Secretary.
He was very pale, almost monosyllabic. And he just said, no, thank you, he didn't want the job. And then I pressed him to take the job, and he said no.
I said that I was very grateful to him for this offer, but that I had made up my mind. And I thought that if relations between us have come to this pass, it would be better for him as well as for myself if I government.
And then at the end of the meeting he got up and he left. And we have not had a conversation since.
Mr. Lamont, anything to say?
He chose to leave. I suspect he regretted it. And I think that upset him very badly and was evident in the way he subsequently behaved.
Well, I was bitterly hurt by it. I don't think it's very surprising. I've entirely recognized that I was someone who was severely damaged politically, but I felt throughout my time at the Treasury I had not been given very good backing from the Prime Minister, to be absolutely honest, and I felt that I had been his protector. I felt, in his phrase, he had frequently said to me that I was the lightning rod that deflected criticism from him. Many, many people said that.
This is not an easy statement for me to make today, but I'm sure that the House will understand that, and I'm sure that
Norman Lamont exacted his revenge 2 weeks later.
to give up being Chancellor of the Exchequer.
His comments at the end of his speech did great damage to the government's standing and to the reputation of the Prime Minister.
There is too much short-termism, too much reacting to events, not enough shaping of events. We give the impression of being in office, but not in power.
By the summer, many Conservative MPs outside the Cabinet were in revolt. On the 22nd of July, an amendment to the Maastricht Treaty's social chapter, cunningly conceived by the opposition, led to the government's defeat by a hair's breadth as rebels and Labour teamed together.
The ayes to the right, 316. The noes to the left, 324.
I think it's fair to say that night of that vote, there's just a general view which I think people had that the party was beginning to fall apart. Because some people like myself would do anything to stop the Maastricht Treaty. There were others who had got involved who they thought were anti-rights, people who didn't like him. And I think it's fair to say that the state of unhappiness and discord of the party was probably greater that night than on any previous occasion.
John Major now declared that the issue was one of confidence in his government.
The sheer impact of what had happened when we had been defeated in the vote the night before, and the threat of a vote of confidence in a general election, had roused the Conservative Party in the country. And many of them were very frustrated. In fact, they were livid with many of the people who'd been voting against us. And by 10 o'clock in the morning, it was evident that as fast as their dignity would permit, many of them were clambering back on board.
Although John Major had got his bill at last, his troubles were not over. The day he won the confidence vote, off-the-cuff remarks after an interview were recorded and made public.
Occasionally private frustration would burst out. I think it's inevitable if you are beset, as frankly the government was on every side at the time. Sometimes there has to be a private valve for that to come out, and sometimes that happened with me in private. I expressed my views somewhat pithily, rather saltily, you might think, occasionally in private. On this occasion, it wasn't as private as I had thought, and my words became public.
Okay. But where do you think most of this poison has come from? It's come from the dispossessed and the never possessed. You and I can both think of ex-ministers who go around causing all sorts of trouble. We have 3 more advances out there.
I was replying generically. I didn't actually specifically have 3 members in mind. I did have people in mind, but they weren't all in the cabinet. What was interesting was that the press immediately assumed who 3 cabinet members might be.
The Fresh Start was dubbed Back to Basics, and it would be yet another calamity in the catalogue of disasters that beset his premiership.
It is time to return to those old core values. Time to get back to basics, to self-discipline and respect for the law.
It was never, from me, a question of individual morality, and I would have shied away from that. It was tied to feelings about single mothers. Hardly likely I'd do that. Norma's mother brought up Norma as a single mother. My sister brought up her children as a single mother. Hardly likely that I would engage in that sort of morality crusade, and nor did I.
But that's just how the press saw it, a moral crusade. With the encouragement from some of the Prime Minister's colleagues on the right, the issue was made one of personal conduct, and triggered a succession of salacious stories about Tory ministers.
Well, I think he might have remembered that a number of members of his cabinet had mistresses, girlfriends, perhaps boyfriends. At least one other family somewhere else. There were quite a lot of junior ministers that had all sorts of liaisons. Several had fathered illegitimate children. Some they supported, some they didn't. It was not a very salubrious bunch in a way.
The Conservative Party didn't invent sex in the 1990s. It was there a long time before. It didn't invent misbehaviour in the 1990s. That was there before. Where I think the media had some justification for the way they behaved is that some of our colleagues did make speeches which seemed to be a morality crusade against single mothers and others. I told them to stop that, but by then, of course, the genie was out.
What I think the media saw in Back to Basics was a wonderful opportunity to shove the knife in deeper and kill this government with 1,000 cuts. And therefore it embarked upon a search of the bedrooms of Westminster and Whitehall and whatnot, and found all sorts of obscure Tories in the wrong bed or whatever. It even found one in France, a most obscure MP whose name I still can't remember. They found him there with them chap.
Every Saturday night, at least it seemed like every Saturday night, I'd be sitting here at home, and about 8 o'clock the telephone call would go, and my Tim Collins, my head of communications at Central Office, would ring up and say, "Chairman, there's this interesting story going in tomorrow in the News of the World or the People or wherever it happened to be," and another story would come through.
As the revelations continued, Back to Basics was quietly dropped. But John Major's government was further damaged, and a new word, sleaze, became commonplace, used to cover both the sexual and financial wrongdoings of MPs.
The sexual things, which were usually matters of absolutely trivial unimportance to the general public, outside the family of the person concerned, helped build up this picture of sleaze. And sleaze played a big part in bringing the government down.
The issue was always Europe. For the first time in many years, a sitting Prime Minister was told to go by a member of his own party, a maverick Eurosceptic.
Why doesn't he stand aside and make way for somebody else who can provide the party and the country with direction and leadership? Bring on the white coat!
In November 1994, 8 Eurosceptics rebelled against a bill to make extra government payments to Brussels. John Major won the vote, but in a show of strength, he threw the rebels out of the party.
John Major was so hopping mad, and I think he thought again that his authority was being undermined, that he ordered the Chief Whip to go ahead with removing the whip from us, which is a bit like losing your work ticket. I woke up next morning and thought, well, what happens to me now? Do I go down the labour exchange with my P45 and register as unemployed?
She did nothing of the sort, and the removal of the whip made the rebels the focus of yet more media attention. To be whipless meant that you were expelled from the Conservative Parliamentary Party, but remained an MP. The expulsion wiped out John Major's majority. Many of his colleagues were uneasy at the move.
I would not have taken the whip away from the rebels, because however unsatisfactory the position was, that actually made it even more unsatisfactory, because it made the people martyrs who the whip was taken away from. I don't think that was a piece of sensible politics, but obviously there was a degree of frustration.
The whipless MPs were able to do real damage to John Major's policies. In December that year, they successfully defeated an increase of VAT on fuel. Faced with an unworkable situation in Parliament and ridiculed in the press for weak leadership, John Major decided that the time had come to invite the rebels back. In April 1995, after 5 months in the wilderness, the whipless MPs were told that they could return to the party without condition or penalty.
we were simply sent a letter to say, from now on, you will receive the whip again unless you write to us and tell us you don't want to, which was the most extraordinary letter. Lo and behold, we were back on the register, so to speak.
By allowing the rebels back without condition, the Prime Minister did himself much damage. There was a feeling that too often he made a stand, only to back down later. The cabinet, like the party, was split on the European question. On one side, Kenneth Clarke, the Chancellor, constantly urged John Major to give no quarter to the Eurosceptics. On the other, Michael Portillo, a right-winger, maintained that he simply wanted leadership.
On one occasion, in a room alone with John Major, and typically, if you were in that situation, you would sit next to the Prime Minister. He'd make a point of calling you over to his side of the table. I said to him, in a very gentle tone, I said, Prime Minister, you know, we are so deeply divided on this European question. Half the cabinet says one thing, the other half says the other. I really think that rather than trying to ride these two horses, you would do much better to decide what your line is going to be and get rid of the half of the cabinet that disagrees with whatever you've decided upon. And if you get rid of the half of the cabinet that includes me, you will never hear me complain, because I think it's the right thing for you to do. I will never complain that you've done that. And John Major typically smiled and was very charming, and he reached out his hand and put it on my arm and said, "Oh no, Michael, I never want to sack you." And to me it was so frustrating because, although it was very charming, it was completely to miss the point. I thought I was making a serious point. I really thought it was better for him to act decisively and have a cabinet around him of people who agreed with a clear-cut policy than to struggle on with these two halves.
The 22nd of June 1995, he strode into the Downing Street garden to make his surprise announcement.
The purpose was quite clear. I would either win, in which case we had a sporting chance, no certainty, a sporting chance of the party behaving itself over Europe as we approached the election, or I would lose.
I am not prepared to see the party I care for laid out on the rack like this for any longer. To remove this uncertainty, I have this afternoon tendered my resignation as leader of the Conservative Party.
I chaired. I thought it was absolutely the right thing to do. I thought that was John at his best. That was John decisive, taking control of events, refusing to be buffeted by them.
The Conservative Party must make its choice. Every leader is leader only with the support of his party.
I thought he was mad.
That is true.
He wants to continue to be Prime Minister. What for? What's he trying to achieve? What is this extremely nice, gentle, malleable personality trying to do?
In short, it is time to put up or shut up. I have nothing more to say this afternoon. Thank you very much.
At the time, a number of people wrote that if I could keep my fingers clinging onto the doorknob of number 10 Downing Street, I would. That couldn't have been more wrong.
Poof, is what I say to that.
My life didn't begin and end with politics, and what was happening was pretty intolerable.
I think he was absolutely determined to stay, as long as he could. I equally think that, paradoxically, he made himself pretty miserable there. And so there was this odd mixture of misery and the limpet, the miserable limpet, if you like, which was a great inhibition to his prime ministership.
All the cabinet rallied round, bar one, John Redwood, the Welsh secretary, who spent the weekend playing cricket and dodging the press. Speculation grew that he was about to stand against the Prime Minister.
Mr. Redwood, sir, are you going to run? No, I told you that I will talk to you on Monday, and I always keep my word, and that's exactly what I will do.
I could not support the leader's decision to resign. I thought it was another mistake, and another mistake that would serve to emphasize weaknesses in the party rather than strengths. It was another diversion from what I thought were the important issues, sorting out taxation, sorting out public services, sorting out the relationship with Europe.
But Redwood's campaign was given an immense boost by a fellow right-wing Eurosceptic, Lady Thatcher, when she gave a speech in Washington.
Is this an endorsement of Mr. Redwood?
Both candidates are sound Conservatives.
I was very surprised when she said that, and I think people took a subliminal message from it.
Next question.
Here was Margaret Thatcher, a Prime Minister who had actually been voted out of office by her fellow members of Parliament, producing a very balanced, equivocal endorsement of her successor, who potentially faced exactly the same difficulty. It was widely interpreted, and I think accurately, as a pretty lukewarm endorsement of me and an encouragement to John Redwood. Handed me a piece of paper. And I looked down at the piece of paper and it had the result.
He had that same look that I remember from the 1992 election. I mean, the first reaction was not euphoria and delight. It was a very deadpan reaction, and there was that same sort of ashen face.
And the question which only he could decide, and he had to decide quickly, was whether it was enough. And I, after a bit of this, I did say what seemed to me to be accurate. I think it's enough.
Out of a possible 329 votes.
John Major had set himself a target of 215 votes. It was a close-run thing.
For John Major, 218. For John Redwood, 89. Abstained, 8. Spoiled, 12. I declare John Major elected.
Everyone thought that was enough. It was, by 3 votes. 4 votes less, and I would have resigned as Prime Minister that evening, and I could not have been persuaded to do otherwise. I had made up my mind, and I would not have been budged on the issue.
The Agriculture Minister warned John Major that there could be a link between mad cow disease and human health. The news came out of the blue and led to a European ban on British beef. To the delight of the Eurosceptics, John Major responded by announcing a policy of non-cooperation with Europe until the ban was lifted.
The fact that we then got into headlong conflict with Europe was actually one of the few really bad mistakes that was made. One of the few things, looking back at that government, I feel ashamed of, rather, was that we then turned that crisis, and this was partly because of pressure on our own backbenches, into an anti-European crusade. It wasn't an anti-European crusade. We had a severe problem with dangerous meat.
When the Prime Minister moved against Europe, as he did in the beef crisis, he had to contend with the powerful Chancellor Ken Clarke and his allies in Cabinet.
He consistently, all the way to the end, to the election, believed that we had to give some more ground to the Eurosceptics, which, of course, they were only too eager to take, but it didn't have the slightest effect. As, to use one of John's favourite phrases, it turned out to be feeding crocodiles. And the great trouble with feeding crocodiles is they'll follow you patiently while you feed them, but you better not run out of buns, because they don't...
But by now there was no way out. John Major's time was up. On the 17th of March 1997, he called a general election to be held 6 weeks later. He headed with his soapbox straight to Luton, in the hope that pictures of his direct appeal to voters would achieve what they had 5 years before, during the previous election campaign. John Major chose to have a long campaign, 6 weeks, in the hope that the feel-good factor, which once won elections, would do so again. More than 300 candidates, 2 of them junior ministers, published their own anti-European manifestos. It was a humiliating snub for the Prime Minister.
I'm afraid that the general view will be a lot of the party behaved monstrously. And in the circumstances, he was proved not to be capable of overwhelming them.
I'm often told it would be a great advantage if I would rule the whole thing out.
The Prime Minister, looking exhausted and depressed, under the watchful eye of Ken Clarke, decided to make a personal appeal to his warring party on the vexed question of the single European currency.
Whether you agree with me or disagree with me, like me or loathe me, don't bind my hands when I am negotiating on behalf of the British nation.
On polling day, the 1st of May 1997, John Major voted as usual in his Huntingdon constituency. At 5 in the afternoon, He was telephoned by Conservative Central Office. The news was not good.
Things seemed to be going very badly, and the Labour Party were moving more and more of their supporters out of seats we thought were marginal into seats we thought, and it looked as though the election result was going to be a good deal worse than we had previously forecast.
John Major returned to his home, the Finings, and that evening he sat down to watch the results on television with his wife Norma and close advisers.
The mood was a very subdued mood in the house that evening. We ate fish and chips, which James Major and I went to get from the local fish and chip shop at about kind of 8 o'clock of the evening, and at 9:30, 20 to 10, we were phoned and told what the exit polls looked like, and at 10 o'clock, obviously, the election coverage programmes both started.
There it is, 10 o'clock, and we say Tony Blair is to be Prime Minister and a landslide is likely.
It was very depressing. It was very depressing because you knew a whole episode was coming to the end. And of course, as the evening unfolded, the results clearly were very bad indeed. And I sat in front of the television watching some of them with a certain air of disbelief. You see people you've known for a very long time, some very good people. People who'd been utterly loyal as well as people who'd been thoroughly disloyal, just losing their seats. And there was no distinction between the two. Whether they were good MPs or bad MPs seemed to have made that evening almost no difference to the results. And I saw people like Ian Lang and Niall Ripkind and Tony Newton all swept out of office.
I think one of the greatest shocks was clearly Michael Portillo. Then John, who'd been very still and just grey, I'd say, during most of the evening. I mean, he was absolutely astounded by that. He really took him back.
John Major left the Finings and went to Count in Huntingdon to hear his own result. Then at 3 in the morning he drove at speed to London to thank party workers and returned for the last time to number 10. His family followed behind.
When we were driving back to London, my car outstripped those immediately following us, and we stopped by the Thames for them to catch up. And as we sat there, you could hear the sounds of revelry from across the Thames in our direction. And it was if you remember, it was a beautiful morning, weather-wise, a lovely day, and you could hear that sound coming across the stillness of the morning. Clearly, a morning for a new start. I thought then, and thought many times thereafter, what differently could I have done? Would it have made a difference? Would we have won? Would we have minimised the defeat? Were there other options that we could have taken? At the time, there were not many occasions where we thought we seriously had an alternative option to follow. But of course, that runs round in your mind for quite a long time as you reconsider the decisions you took and their impact.
The following morning, John Major prepared to leave number 10. He thanked all his staff at a tearful farewell.
I think the only other thing I did was to leave a bottle of champagne upstairs for Tony and Cherie Blair. I just left a brief message which, as far as I can recall, was, "It's a great job. I hope you enjoy it." And I propped it up against the bottle and we left Downing Street.
John Major stepped out of number 10 for the last time and set off for the Oval to indulge his passion, cricket. The massive defeat was hardly unexpected and made more bearable by the hundreds of thousands of letters he received from well-wishers. John Major's allies say he left a country more at ease with itself. The economy was in its best shape for some time, and many of his reforms have endured to the present. Yet the Conservative civil war over Europe blighted his time in office. He fought to keep his party together, but never achieved the unity he desired. It may have been an impossible task. It was his own reputation which suffered.
The great issue, I suppose, at the moment, which is open borders. I mean, this has produced probably an existential crisis, an overused word. Private Eye will start an existential crisis column quite soon. But nonetheless, a very, very big crisis for Europe. This Europe of open borders, the Schengen Europe, people are able to move from one country to another very quickly. Liam Fox has raised the question of terrorists as well being able to use this. And this does worry an awful lot of people watching this programme.
Indeed it does, and of course they're right to worry about that. The question is whether we would be able to stop that in anything we did. Now, if we actually look at the question of freedom of movement, there are several things to say about it. Well, firstly, freedom of movement is said to be sacrosanct because it is one of the 4 European freedoms. That is a totally phony argument. Another of the 4 European freedoms is freedom of movement of goods and services. Yet Germany and France and other countries block our banking, block our insurance, block our technology services. So the belief that that is absolutely fundamental is unchanging.
Like Liam Fox at this point.
No, well, they do. And that's what the sort of thing we're going to have to change. The bigger issues are why I'm absolutely convinced we need to stay in for our future.
If we would get control of our borders back, period.
Well, consider what that means. Half our immigration at the moment doesn't come from the European area. It comes from the old Commonwealth and elsewhere.
But we would have control over that.
Just a moment. And we have been, well, we've been letting more people in than most of the people objecting to us being in Europe would like. But without them, we wouldn't have a transport system. We certainly wouldn't have a national health system. So the point is, would we be as safe? No. Would we be as well off? No. Would we be as influential? No. So that is the point.
Would you like to order, sir?
Yes, I will have a steak.
How'd you like it?
Oh, raw, please.
And what about the vegetables?
Oh, they'll have the same as me.
That'll be happy.
How would you like your steak, sir?
Oh, well done, please.
And what about the vegetables?
Carrots and peas, I think.
Oh,